Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to Late Night Learning. I am your host, Dr. Anthony Palomba. Now today we're going to be going through survey method. This is probably one of the methods in which you're most familiar with. Many of you have likely taken a questionnaire or some sort of online survey when you're leaving Target or maybe when you're leaving a Starbucks coffee shop. And so the survey method primarily is focused around looking at people's beliefs and opinions. On a scale of 1 to 5, what did you think of that Frappuccino? On a scale of 1 to 5, how clean were the aisles at Target? Don't answer that. And so in this lecture, we're going to be going through how to develop a survey and things to be mindful of when we're creating a particular questionnaire. How do we frame questions? How should we expect people to answer them? Are they covering too much? Are they covering too little? These are some of the things we're going to be getting into on Late Night Learning today. Let's get started. And so what is a survey? So a survey seeks opinions and perceptions of consumers. It is optimal for seeking out generalizations from the population. Now, what does that mean? Generalizations from the population. If we think about how a survey is typically released, it is often given to a broad swath of a population, otherwise known as a sample. For instance, if a survey is sent out to the entire U.S. population, such as the U.S. Census, it's very likely that not everyone will respond to it, right? By and large, most people do, but not everyone. And so, as best as the government can, they go after a sample. A sample is a portion of a population. It's not everyone, because remember, we can't possibly get everyone to respond to a survey. And so you may say to yourself, well, I'm interested in conducting research for Victoria's Secret, Express, Gap, Toyota, Honda. I'm going after adults 18 to 25 years old. That would be called your sampling frame. That is the frame by which we are sending out a survey to and hopefully gaining data collection from. We're gaining data responses from. And so that is a sampling frame. Simply put, how your sampling is defined, the definition of your sample. How would you describe your sample? And so it's important to think about this even before we touch on how to create a survey, because you want to be mindful of who you're going after before you even create the survey itself. Let's keep going. And so with the structure of a questionnaire, there are a few things you want to be mindful of here. First is clear language. It has to be clear. You can't ask me how much milk I drink in a given week. Are you going by cup? Are you going by gallon? What kind of milk? Remember, any question you ask people, it has to be refined and clear. Nothing will frustrate your participants more than reading through a survey and saying to themselves, I don't know what they're talking about. I'm frustrated. I can't give them a good answer. I don't want to do the rest of this. That is the last thing you want to be engaged with here. Second thing is brevity. You want to be short with your questions. The length of your questions should be short in character. And so with brevity, you may simply want to ask, what is your favorite car color? Instead of, what is the favorite color that you prefer when selecting a vehicle or other transportation vehicle for that matter, right? That question isn't clear, it's long-winded, and people are going to roll their eyes and groan. We need to avoid that. For the third bullet here, we have validity. Are you actually measuring what you think you're measuring? If you're interested in knowing, for instance, what people listen to, you want to be sure that you're asking a question surrounding what people listen to. But that's not enough, right? You might ask people, well, what do you listen to? That's not clear. Instead, you may say to yourself, well, can we refine this question further? Maybe I can ask people about streaming music services like Pandora or Spotify or SoundCloud. Maybe I can do that in order to further refine the question so I know what I'm asking. And I have to think about not only what I'm asking, but how are people going to respond? Fourthly, reliability. Cronbach alpha scores. These scores should be familiar to you because we did go through this in a previous lecture surrounding statistical significance in research studies. So Cronbach's alpha scores, if they're high, they mean that the scales that are used in questionnaires are replicable. Will you find similar results if you did this study with a similar sample frame again? And so the idea is that if we ask questions in one survey, if we gave the survey out 6 months later to the same population and gained a similar sample, we should have similar results, right? The survey questions themselves should be reliable. And you want to avoid low measurement error. If you take into account validity, if you take into account reliability, you're going to be fine on your path toward creating a survey. Let's keep going. So let's go through some tips on structure of a question. If we look here, survey questions are best usually when they set a time frame, right? You want to ask people in the last week, in the last month, in the last year. Help your participants understand what time frame they should be reflecting on. Give them help here. And so it's really, really nice to be able to ask participants in the last week, have you visited any car sales websites or any kind of retail websites or any kind of cologne websites or perfume websites, right? We're able to do this in a manner in which we're able to help limit the amount of energy that's committed to reflecting upon a particular question. So it's tough for people to remember exact details of the past as well. I would not ask people, do you remember your last grade in gym class in high school, right? You don't want to ask people that are about things that are very, very detailed and specific and are in the past, because otherwise they're going to become frustrated. Second, while asking somebody's inclination to purchase, view, or to try products in the future is okay, it is often hard for consumers to gauge exact interest. In the future, how likely are you to purchase a home? I mean, it's a guess, right? It's not something that consumers can readily comment on because it'll be something in the future. Participants can comment on things best in the present. I can tell you how I feel about this cup of coffee on a scale of 1 to 10. I can tell you how I feel about this color on a pair of shorts or pants on a scale of 1 to 10. Consumers are really, really good at doing evaluations in the present. So bear that in mind as you're creating these survey questions. Once again, the more specific the question is, the easier it is for the respondent to respond and have more accuracy in their responses. Let's keep going. So we can talk about not only what a survey question should look like, but also, generally speaking, the anatomy of the survey and how questions should fall along when we're planning our own survey. I can tell you from experience in industry, I did some research for Sesame Street. And when we were doing survey research for them, what we used to do was we would have 3 different sampling frame segments, or screeners, if you will. And so we would have parents of children 0 to 2 years old, parents of children 0 to 4 years old, and young adults without children. And so we looked at those 3 segments, if you will. And so screeners serve as a way in which to cut up and segment your audiences. You may only want to look at African American women. You may only want to look at Asian American women. Or you may want to look at Asian American women, African American women, and Caucasian women for whatever reason. And so you may look at those 3 segments and you may say, I want to use that as a screener question. And so in the beginning of your survey, typically what you're interested in is filtering out or screening out participants. Either you're looking for participants who don't belong in the survey. So if I'm a Caucasian male, I don't belong in the survey that was just discussed. Also, I'm also doing this in order to place certain participants in different segments. I want to be sure that when I open up my data, all of the data cut up, if you will, has already been done. I can track and trace and see how Hispanic women consume yogurt or purchase cars or go to the gym. And I can do the same for others because I've put in my screener questions in the beginning. And so I can carefully analyze the data a little bit better. And so screener questions are really useful in that regard. Again, keeping out people who don't belong, number 1, and number 2, making sure that we have people falling into the different sampling frames that we were interested in. Let's go back to that slide. And so if we think about the body of questions, and we're going to be getting into that in a minute, unaided awareness and aided awareness are very, very crucial here. Unaided awareness and aided awareness help your consumers start jogging their memories. Remember, you are not going to ask a participant who is your favorite Desperate Housewife or who is your favorite Real Housewife without carefully guiding them through that logic behind that question. And so if your survey is about coffee, you're not going to ask people for the first question, how often do you visit Starbucks? Or how many times in the last week have you gone to Starbucks? Generally speaking, you want to warm up your participants. And so you may say, well, what comes to mind when you think of coffee? Or what comes to mind when you think of a Dunkin' Donuts or a Starbucks or a Gloria Jeans? These are ways in which to start massaging your participants' brains and to get them energetic and focused and eager to start taking the questions. As they go through the survey, they will get to your meat and potatoes, if you will. They will get to the meaty part, the heavy part, the real important part of the survey. But you want to kind of guide them along. You may ask people about recall. Do you recall this advertisement? Do you recognize this brand? You may ask them about concept questions. What if there was a coffee that had 5 different blended coffees in it? What would you think of that? What if I told you it was Peruvian coffee mixed with Kenyan coffee? Would it make a difference? You can also ask questions about brand loyalty. And then toward the end, you may want to think about questions about likelihood to purchase, interest to purchase product. What a lot of people like to ask at the end is, how can we improve this? What can we do better? It could be Toyota, it could be Honda, it could be another company that's asking, how can we improve our service, right? Some of you may have had a customer service survey, and the survey may have asked at the end, how can we improve our service? At the end, you may put your demographic questions. These are your questions surrounding education, gender, race and ethnicity, household income. It's good to put those questions at the end because if you put them in the beginning, it may be a bit distracting for your participants. They may be hesitant to discuss income because it's the third question you've asked them rather than the 30th question you've asked them. So personally, I like putting the demographic questions at the end because they kind of are distracting and you want your participants to stay on point with your survey. If you're going to move the demographic questions anywhere, they belong in one of two places, at the beginning or at the end, never in the middle. So you'll decide where you want to put your demographic questions. Let's keep going. Screeners. So I mentioned screeners earlier, but just as kind of a review here, and to kind of go into it a little bit more in depth, we are filtering out participants to meet quotas and participant criteria. And so filters also help us with reaching quotas. Maybe you need 100 Hispanic women, ages 18 to 30. Maybe you only need 50 African American males who play video games more than 10 hours a week. And so if that's the case, then the filters also help you with quotas. You want to make sure that you have an even distribution of participants as well here. And so screeners do encourage that. As you can see here, you usually only want 2 to 5 screeners. It gets really complicated after that. So you're going to want to think about different characteristics and attributes that you absolutely think are vital to the sampling frame that you're going after. If you need to cut down on screeners, you can also try to target your sample blend better. What that means is if you have 10 different screeners and you're like, I need Caucasian males 18 to 25 years old who live in the Northeast, play video games more than 10 hours a day, and also work out at the gym, that's a lot. Maybe you want to think about the company that you're going through to send out the survey. Maybe they can target people a little bit better so that you don't need as many screeners. Maybe they can go after people who go to the gym, or maybe they can find gamers to begin with so you don't have to ask those questions in the survey itself. Let's keep going. Unaided and aided awareness. And so we have two different questions here that I was discussing earlier. So for unaided awareness, you're tapping into consumers' underlying subconscious. What comes to mind when you think of television? What comes to mind when you think of entertainment? What comes to mind when you think of women's clothing? What comes to mind when you think of men's clothing, right? These are questions that are very abstract, really aren't focused on one particular thing, and really allow people to start doing word association, right? What comes to mind when I think of men's clothing? Buttons, collars. I'll think of fit. I'll think of the tailor of the shirt or pant. I'll think of dress. I'll think of casual. I'll think of athletic, right? These are probably responses consumers are going to have for you. And often with unaided and aided awareness, these participants are responding in an open text question. They're not really selecting an answer choice here. It's more so that they're writing down words. We also have aided awareness here. Aided awareness here could be when you think of streaming video on demand services, what comes to mind? Hopefully Netflix, Hulu, Amazon Prime Video, and HBO. And so with aided awareness, what you're thinking about here is what segment of society do you want your participants to focus in? What are they interested in reflecting upon? And so if the questionnaire is focused on television, or if it's focused on movies, or if it's focused on going to the movie theater, let's say, an aided awareness question limits the scope of what you want your consumers to reflect upon here. So rather than asking people in an unaided awareness question, oh, what do you think of when you think of movies? An aided awareness question may be, what do you think about when you go to the movie theater? Or what do you think about when you watch a movie from home? Right? It's a little bit more detailed. It's a little bit more refined here. Let's keep going. Open-ended questions. Open-ended questions are wonderful here. Open-ended questions allow us to really think about what participants think when they are given a particular statement or response. And so here you can see that we have open-ended questions to really get a sense of the variety and the variation of what people state or think when they're exposed to a particular idea. You may think that people only think about Dunkin' Donuts and Starbucks if you ask them, oh, what comes to mind when you think of coffee or a coffee shop? But they may also list the seat comfort. They may also list the coffee trays. They may also talk about the texture of the cup. They may also talk about the texture of the coffee. They may also talk about different kinds of sugar and cream and milk available. They may also talk about food menu options. They may also talk about noise level or music. You'd be surprised how many things people can list in an open-ended question. So it's kind of vital that we have this because it really does allow us to kind of do our homework and to make sure that we've covered all bases as we're doing our own survey drafting. Let's go back to that slide. What we can see here also is that with open-ended questions at the third bullet, it's important to have these questions for budget constrictions. You may not have an opportunity to further investigate an idea or concept. And so open-ended questions are usually cheaper to run, and they're able to really capture a lot of information, and they may allow for a follow-up study as well. You may be doing a survey and you may go to your coworker John or Jane or Jack or whoever, and you may say, well, listen, I did this open-ended question at the end of our car sales survey, trying to figure out what people thought of the latest edition of Honda cars made available, and many of them were looking for Vespas. Many of them were looking for similar kinds of transportation to be sold here. I know it's not really related to what we were trying to accomplish here, but maybe in the next survey, maybe we add this. It's kind of interesting. And so open-ended questions can also inspire future surveys and future research studies, for that matter. Let's move on to the next slide. So tips and tricks. Tips and tricks. These are some ways in which to further analyze your survey questions just to get a better sense of how they feel, how they come across, and to be mindful of the different kinds of answers you may get. So for instance, this is known as double-barreled questions. This is something you want to avoid, to be clear. No double-barreled questions. Okay, let's look at the first bullet here. Did you find the classes you took during your first semester in college much more difficult and intriguing than in your high school classes? What's wrong with that sentence? Yeah, if you look carefully at that question, you can see that I asked people if they found their classes they took during the first semester in college much more difficult and intriguing. Are those two different questions? They are. And so it's important to see this. What's the resolve or resolution here? You want to be mindful of breaking apart your questions. Ask two questions. Or if you're pressed for time and if you're already at max capacity with the amount of questions you've inputted into your survey, you may want to think about getting rid of one to have a discussion with your research colleagues as well to kind of determine whether or not you need the question. For the second bullet here, was the boat ride fun and informative about Brazilian tree frogs? Fun and informative do not go hand in hand. They can absolutely be mutually exclusive. And so that question should also be broken up. And for the third bullet, how might we rewrite these questions? Break them up. For the first bullet, ask about how difficult these classes were. And then in the second question for the first bullet, ask about how intriguing these classes were. For the second bullet here, first ask about whether or not the boat ride was fun. Then you can ask if it was informative. And so this is something I commonly see in a lot of surveys. You want to be mindful that you don't do this. Break up your questions if you run into this. Let's keep going. Mutual exclusivity. This is important to note here. So mutual exclusivity ensures that each answer choice has no overlap. I'll explain. For the first question here, how would you like to receive coupons from our coffee shops in the future? Newspaper, magazine, flyers, mailings, email, other. Please specify. As a deviation from this, an other answer is always a good thing to have. It covers your butt when you're drafting a survey, and it ensures that all possible responses will be acknowledged and included into the data collection here. So if we look at this carefully, are flyers and mailings similar? Do we have flyers in newspapers? Do we have flyers in magazines? And do we sometimes have flyers in mailings? We do, don't we? So this question could be confusing to a lot of people because they may not know which one to select here. Flyers and mailings kind of overlap. Not to mention, email has mailings as well. So what does that really mean here? You may want to clarify these answer choices a little bit more. Maybe you get rid of flyers, or maybe you get rid of mailings, or you rewrite those answer choices so that they're clearer for your audience. Let's keep moving along. Exhaustive categories. You want to make sure that every possible answer choice is available here. Some of you may recall Roy G. Biv from your biology class, the color spectrum, right? Roy G. Biv is red, orange, yellow, etc., etc. And so instead of Roy G. Biv, and I gave you Oi G. Biv, you would not have red as an answer choice. That's an issue. And so you can see here something similar. If we look at education here, this is an exhaustive list of education, assuming everyone went for higher education. So as long as you know that about your sample here, this question works. Associate's degree, bachelor's degree, master's degree, PhD, JD, MD, or other professional degree. And 6, none of the above. You may also have an other statement there if you wish. If you look at the bottom bullet, race not exhaustive, white or Caucasian, black or African American, or Asian. What about Hispanic Americans? What about Filipinos? What about Japanese? There may be other different races and ethnicities you may want to represent here. And you may elect not to offer Asian American as an answer choice. You may say to yourself instead, well, I'd like for people to identify as, Korean or Japanese or Chinese. And so race and ethnicity is a question you may want to kind of reflect upon a little bit, because you want to make sure that you're capturing races and ethnicities that are relevant, to the study itself. Often I've seen white or Caucasian, black or African American, Asian or Asian American, Hispanic or Hispanic American, and other. That typically is the case here. You may want to include other ethnicities as well, but the goal here is to ensure every answer choice is available. With race and ethnicity, you're probably not going to be listing a dozen races or ethnicities. Your best option is probably to put white or Caucasian, black or African American, Asian or Asian American, Hispanic or Hispanic American, and other. Your other generally will be probably between 2 to 8% of your sampling frame. Anyhow, it generally is a smaller frame. And again, it's a little difficult to capture all of these races and ethnicities into one question. Let's move along. Leading questions, and we'll wrap up with this particular slide. Leading questions. So you want to be careful with leading questions because oftentimes they might bias or prompt your participant to answer in a particular way. To make sure that all homeless people have a place to live, would you support new tax increases to provide X program? Now, unless you were born without a soul in your body, you will feel compelled to say yes. Of course I want to house the homeless. Of course I want to support new tax increases. But do you? Do you really? Some of you may not. And it's because you've been asked about homeless people in kind of a leading manner, you're guilted to say yes. And so you may have the broad part of your sampling frame saying, oh yes, I definitely want tax increases. I definitely want to provide for the homeless. And then you have, Proposition 8 that is voted on by people in the county. And then you might scratch your head and say, well, wait a minute though. We polled people. They were so interested in supporting new tax increases. How is it that when we looked at the votes, they didn't vote for it? It's likely because the way that you asked the question prompted people to say yes because they didn't want to think of themselves as stingy and crude and terrible people. So be mindful of this as you move along. The best way to think about creating any kind of survey is that it's a process. Even to this day, with the publications I have, with the research and consulting and other things that I've done, I still have to draft and redraft and edit my survey questions. It doesn't end. It doesn't end when you have a master's degree, a bachelor's degree, a PhD. We still struggle to an extent when we're writing questions. Another tip here is to read your questions out loud. You'll catch any kind of errors, anything that sounds weird or wrong or different here. It's really, really useful to do this because, again, other people are going to be taking your survey and you just want to make sure that you're clear. Well, that's all the time we have on Late Night Learning. As always, keep laughing and keep learning.